The August sun of 1887 beat down mercilessly on Silver Creek, Colorado. The main street of the town, bleached to a dull sheen, kicked up dust with every step, settling on weathered signs and the faces of passers-by. The air was heavy, smelling of dry grass and, somewhere in the distance, despair. Even the old, life-worn dogs preferred to doze in the meager shade of awnings, not daring to venture out into the scorching heat. Elizabeth Betsy Harper, 34, stood at the wooden counter of the seed merchant's shop. She was a tall woman, once perhaps statuesque, but years of hardship and the bitterness of loss had stooped her shoulders, and the sun and wind had etched a web of fine lines on her face. Her once vibrant blue eyes now seemed dim, yet in their depths, if one looked closely, a spark of stubbornness still flickered, unburned even in life's most intense fires. The scent of burlap, dried herbs, and earth filled the small shop, but Betsy only smelled the dust clinging to her old dress and the anxiety caught in her throat. In her tightly clenched palm lay her last valuable possession, a gold coin. Small yet weighty, warm from her touch. It was a gift from her late husband, Henry. He had given it to her on their wedding day, saying it was for a rainy day, then added with a husky chuckle, or a bright one, Betsy, depending on luck. Now, that day had come. The coin gleamed dully, reflecting the scarce light filtering through the dusty window. It could buy flour to last another week, or kerosene to keep the lamps in their rented shack from going out completely. It could buy the illusion of stability for a few more days. Around Betsy, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, her two children bustled. Thomas, a 12-year-old boy, thin as a reed but with a nascent determination in his dark eyes, hovered by a barrel of dried apples, trying to reach one. His clothes, once his father's, hung loose on his frame. Anna, an 8-year-old girl, with unruly, uncombed blonde curls that kept escaping from under her frayed straw bonnet, clung to her mother's skirt. Her little finger was tucked into her mouth, and her large, innocent eyes curiously explored the colorful seed packets hanging on the walls. She didn't understand why they were here when an empty cupboard awaited them at home, along with impending eviction. Their last few cents had been spent on yesterday's bread and matches. "Mama, will there be milk?" Anna whispered softly, tugging at Betsy's skirt. "I want milk." Betsy gently stroked her head, feeling her heart clench with pain. The merchant, a mustachioed man with keen eyes, short but sturdy, leaned on the counter. "Something caught your eye, Mrs. Harper? Or just looking?" As usual, his tone was neutral, but Betsy detected a hint of pity she loathed. She prided herself on never begging. "Never." Betsy held up the coin. I want to buy seeds." The merchant's eyes narrowed. "Seeds, Mrs. Harper? With this sun in your land?" He trailed off, unwilling to speak the truth aloud. Everyone in Silver Creek knew about the Harper's land. 3 acres of stony wasteland outside town, inherited from Henry. It was considered completely unfit for farming. Too many rocks, too little water, and too close to the sun-baked hills where even the most stubborn weeds barely survive. "Do you have that corn?" Betsy asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. The merchant frowned. He knew what she meant. A few weeks ago, he had received a small batch of drought-resistant corn seeds from Mexico. It was an experiment, smuggled in and sold for an exorbitant price. He warned everyone who inquired, "It's a big risk. Needs special care. There's no guarantee it'll sprout in our climate. It's not for everyone." He always added that with a certain look, emphasizing that these seeds were only for those who could afford to fail. For Betsy Harper, it wouldn't be a failure. It would be death. Betsy looked at the gold coin. Her fingers gripped it so tightly her knuckles were white. She imagined the coin transforming into a bag of flour, into a filling but temporary meal for her children. And then, empty pockets again, and that fear once more. But another thought, stubborn and burning, pierced her mind. "Henry, the land gives to those who believe in it, Betsy," Henry used to say, sitting by the fire after a long day when he first started working their plot. "True faith isn't about seeing, but about doing when you see nothing." He was a dreamer, her Henry, and that dream, wild and seemingly impossible, now lived within her. Thomas, who had finally secured a dried apple, approached his mother. "Mama, why do we need seeds? We don't even have..." He didn't finish, but Betsy understood. "We don't even have anything." Anna, pressed against her leg, looked up, her eyes full of questioning trust. She always believed in her mother, no matter what she did. That innocent faith was, for Betsy, both her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. These seeds, they require special care. The merchant spoke again, his voice sounding like an attempt to dissuade her. They need a patient hand, and plenty of water, if it ever comes. Betsy felt the internal conflict tearing her apart. Reason screamed, buy food, survive another week, but intuition, amplified by Henry's whispers from the past, and burning maternal love, demanded otherwise. Give them a chance for a future. A real future, not just temporary existence. If she failed, they would lose everything. Their meager shack, their last coins, and perhaps their last hope. They would be thrown onto the street, and no one would offer a hand. The town was cruel to failures, but if she dared, and these seeds, this golden grain of hope, sprouted, then they would have a chance at their own land, their own harvest, their independence. A chance Betsy knew was their last. She looked up at the merchant. Her gaze was steady, without a hint of doubt. I'll take the corn. The merchant nodded. He knew it was useless to argue. There was something in her eyes, something ancient and unbreakable, that set her apart. She handed him the gold coin. The coin's clink as it landed on the wooden counter was loud in the quiet shop. He gave her a small bag of seeds, so light and insignificant. Yet to Betsy, it weighed an entire future. She took the bag, feeling its tiny weight in her palm. Anna stopped bustling and looked curiously at the mysterious gift. Thomas stepped closer, his eyes, now free of skepticism, examining the bag. Come on, children, Betsy said softly, turning towards the door. We have work to do. They stepped out of the stuffy shop into the scorching sun of Silver Creek. Beyond the town, as far as the eye could see, stretched arid hills where even in the most bountiful years, weeds barely survived. Now, they seemed even more inhospitable. Betsy looked at the horizon. It was madness. It was their last chance. And she knew it was just the beginning. Her faith, like a tiny seed, had been planted in the driest soil of her life. All that remained was to wait. The Harper's plot of land lay a few miles outside town, where the scorched prairies began to merge with the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The path to it was little more than 2 dusty ruts, carved by infrequent travelers in the wind. The sun here was even more merciless than in Silver Creek, draining the last moisture from the sparse vegetation. Every stone seemed to glow white-hot, and the air above them shimmered with heat. When Betsy, Thomas, and Anna finally reached the site was disheartening. The children, who had retained a semblance of optimism after the mysterious seed purchase, froze. Before them stretched 3 acres of stony land, strewn with boulders the size of heads, thickly overgrown with thorny bushes that clung to life like last survivors. Nearby, where Henry had once dreamed of a stream, lay only a dried-up riverbed, eroded by time and drought, resembling an old scar on the face of the earth. And this is our inheritance? Thomas's voice was filled with disbelief and disappointment. He surveyed the barren landscape, and his shoulders drooped. In his 12-year-old eyes, there was a clear understanding of how hopeless this endeavor seemed. Anna, who had initially gazed around with wonder, was now quiet, clinging to Betsy's skirt. Her little finger was back in her mouth. Even in her innocent world, this land didn't look like a cornfield. Betsy took a deep breath of the dusty, hot air. Her heart constricted at the sight of this desolate patch, but she didn't let doubt show on her face. This is our chance, Thomas, she said firmly, though each word was an effort. And we have to earn it with our hands. She cast off her frayed shawl, revealing thin but strong arms. Then, bending down, Betsy began to uproot the first thorny bush, her fingers pricking on sharp thorns, but she only clenched her jaw tighter. The earth was hard as rock. Every twig resisted, unwilling to surrender. Help me gather stones, she told the children. We need clear land. Every little stone, even the smallest, can hinder growth. Thomas, though reluctantly, obeyed. He began picking up stones, tossing them aside, creating small piles. He grumbled under his breath, skeptically eyeing the enormous amount of work. But he did it. Anna, in contrast, took to the task with childish enthusiasm. She found the tiniest pebbles, put them in her small apron, and then solemnly emptied them into the common pile, as if participating in a grand game. The day waned, and the sun began to slowly set behind the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, which loomed in the distance, reminding them of nature's grandeur and inaccessibility. The family worked until their strength completely left them. Their hands were calloused, their clothes covered in dust and dirt, and their bodies ached from the unaccustomed labor. On the small plot of land where they worked, a cleared area had already formed. The next day, as soon as dawn broke, Betsy and the children returned to the plot. With every hour of work, every uprooted bush, every extracted stone, Betsy felt her resolve strengthen. She taught the children how to properly remove weeds, how to break up hard clumps of earth with the hoe Henry had left in the shed. "Patience," she told Thomas, when he irritably threw down the tool. "The earth doesn't like haste. It likes respect." Thomas, though still grumbling, gradually got into the work, seeing his mother's perseverance. He no longer just threw stones. He began stacking them into neat borders around the cleared sections. One day, as Betsy, exhausted, bent over a particularly large boulder, she noticed something unusual. Beneath the stone, where the earth seemed particularly damp, a tiny, almost invisible, glint shimmered. With difficulty, she moved the boulder, and there it was, a small spring, pushing through a crack in the rock. A thin trickle of clear, cold water flowed over the stones, forming a small wet puddle. It wasn't a river, not a full-flowing stream, but for this arid land, it was a miracle. "Water! Children! Water!" Betsy's cry was filled with such joy that the children immediately dropped their tools and ran over. They looked at the spring with the same reverence as she did. Thomas, with his usual skepticism, even knelt to check if it was a mirage. Anna stretched out her small hand and scooped up some water, then brought it to her lips. "Cold," she whispered, and her eyes sparkled. This tiny spring, hidden beneath the stones, was the first true sign of hope, reinforcing her determination. They spent the rest of the day by the spring, clearing it of debris, clearing a path for the water. It was exhausting work, but it filled them with new meaning. The skepticism of others was as palpable as the stones on their plot. The Miller family, their closest neighbors, living a couple of miles down the road, often drove by. Mrs. Miller, a kind-hearted but gossip-prone woman, waved from her wagon, her eyes expressing sincere sympathy. Mr. Miller, a stout man with a bushy mustache, on the other hand, just shook his head, looking at their labor. One day, as Betsy dragged a particularly heavy bag of stones to the edge of the plot, Mr. Miller stopped his wagon. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice loud and kindly, but with an undertone of condescension, "you're wasting your time. This land is no good." Henry was a dreamer, of course, but he waved his hand, implying that Henry's dreams had cost him his life and left Betsy with an impossible inheritance. "Sell it while you still can. Buy yourself a good house in town before it's too late." Betsy straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow. Her back ached, but she met his gaze. "Thank you for the advice, Mr. Miller," she said calmly, but there was no hint of gratitude in her voice. "But I know what I'm doing." He just shook his head and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. Mr. Miller's words, though well-intentioned, only intensified her inner struggle. Every day spent on this plot was a day without income, a day when the money for their shack's rent dwindled like ice in the sun. The payment deadline was approaching, and they had nothing but this plot and a small bag of rare seeds. The children, initially unaware of the full gravity of their situation, now began to understand the seriousness of it. Thomas often asked how much money they had left and when they could return to town. Anna, though she continued to play with pebbles, her laughter grew quieter, and her eyes more often lowered to the ground. Betsy saw this, and it only spurred her forward. They weren't just clearing land. They were building a foundation for their future, and every day of their shared labor was not only a struggle for survival but a form of silent prayer offered to the sky above Colorado. The transition from clearing the land to planting the seeds was subtle, but it marked a profound shift in the landscape of their hope. What had once been a desolate, stone-strewn expanse was slowly taking on some semblance of order beneath their determined hands. Betsy had carefully studied the instructions the seed merchant had given her. A small, worn diagram on a fragile piece of paper, showing the exact spacing and, crucially, the method for conserving every precious drop of moisture. "See, Thomas," she explained, kneeling in the dust, her voice low and patient, her fingers deftly shaping the earth. "We don't just plant them deep. We build a little mound, like this, around each seed. It catches the dew, gathers every whisper of rain. The earth holds it, just for our corn." Her hands, now tougher and more calloused, moved with a newfound grace, as if instinctively understanding the language of the soil. Thomas, though still prone to dramatic sighs, no longer openly scoffed. He mimicked his mother's movements, his own young hands clumsy at first, then growing steadily more confident. He might grumble about the endless, back-breaking work under the relentless sun, but he did it. He felt the dry earth sifting through his fingers, molded the small, protective depressions, and carefully dropped each precious golden seed into its designated spot. He didn't quite believe in miracles, but he believed in his mother's unwavering will. Anna, with her boundless energy and unshakable faith in Betsy, became the meticulous guardian of the seeds. She walked along the rows of newly formed mounds, her small fingers gently stroking the soil, whispering encouraging words to the unseen life nestled beneath. Her sun-bleached hair, constantly escaping from under her bonnet, shone like a halo as she moved between the rows, a tiny, determined figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. She saw hope where Thomas only saw dirt, and her innocent joy was the fragile thread that kept Betsy grounded. The days merged into a rhythm of arduous work. From sunup to sundown, they toiled. The earth, once so resistant, seemed to soften incrementally beneath their persistent touch. Rows of small, uniform mounds now stretched across the cleared acres, a pattern of painstaking care etched onto the barren canvas of the land. Each mound was a tiny prayer, a silent testament to their desperate gamble. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down with renewed intensity, Betsy noticed Anna moving slower than usual. Her typically quick steps dragged, and her bright laughter was muted. "Anna, are you all right, dear?" Betsy asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Anna too quickly, shook her head. "Just tired, Mama. Too much sun," but her cheeks were flushed with more than just heat, and her eyes, usually so clear, seemed too bright. A sharp, cold stab of fear pierced Betsy's heart. She knew that look. It was the insidious onset of fever, a silent enemy far more terrifying than any bandit or debt collector. That night, Anna barely touched her meager supper. She coughed, a dry, racking cough that seemed to tear at Betsy's soul. "Go to sleep, little one," Betsy urged, her voice softer than usual. She helped Anna onto her pallet, tucking the thin, worn blanket around her. Anna shivered despite the oppressive heat, and her skin felt hot to the touch. The fever was indeed there. Betsy sat beside her daughter, placing a damp cloth on Anna's forehead. Her mind raced. No money for a doctor, no medicine, save for a few dried herbs she'd gathered by the spring. The image of the gold coin, now gone, flashed through her mind. Had she done the right thing? Should she have bought food, medicine, instead of these dreams? A bitter taste filled her mouth. The future of their family, the very life of her child, seemed to hang by a thread. The weight of this new, terrifying conflict pressed down on her. She stayed by Anna's bedside for hours, listening to her shallow, fitful breaths. Thomas, on his own pallet across the room, feigned sleep, but Betsy knew he was awake. She felt his quiet vigil, the unspoken worry emanating from his small body. Later, as the moon climbed high and bathed the shack's single window in silver light, Betsy finally drifted into a restless doze, worn out by fear and anxiety. She woke abruptly just before dawn, the air still cool and fresh. Anna's breathing seemed a little less strained, her skin a fraction cooler. But the cough persisted. Lying there, listening to the vast silence of the prairie, broken only by Anna's soft whimpers, Betsy heard another sound. Faint, rhythmic splashing from outside. Her heart pounded. Bandits? Animals? She slowly rose, grabbed the rusty poker from the hearth, and peered out the window. In the dim pre-dawn light, she saw him. Thomas. He was in the field, moving between the rows of newly planted mounds. In his hands, he held the dented tin bucket they used for washing. He dipped it into the small, precious spring they'd discovered, then carefully, painstakingly, trickled water onto each mound. He moved like a ghost, his shoulders hunched, his movements deliberate and silent. He, who had scoffed at endless work, who had complained about stupid rocks, was now, in the dead of night, secretly watering the seeds, giving them the life-giving moisture the sky had denied. A wave of warmth, potent and unexpected, surged through Betsy's chest. Her eyes misted with unshed tears. Her children, they were growing not just in stature, but in spirit. Thomas, in his quiet act of rebellion against his own skepticism, displayed a responsibility that made her heart ache with pride. And Anna, despite her illness, held an unwavering faith, her small body a testament to perseverance. Betsy understood in that moment that she was not alone in this desperate gamble. They were in this together, a chosen family, bound by shared struggle and unspoken love. The sun finally peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and orange. Betsy returned to Anna, her resolve renewed. She brewed a strong tea from dried sage and mint, pressing the warm cup to Anna's lips. The next few days were a succession of anxious nursing for Anna and relentless toil in the fields. Betsy worked until her muscles screamed, then returned to Anna, massaging her aching limbs, whispering stories, humming lullabies she remembered from her own childhood. The thought of losing Anna infused her with desperate energy. Every tiny mound she perfected, every weed she pulled, was a silent plea, a desperate bargain with the harsh land. And then, one morning, it happened. As Betsy walked along the rows, her gaze sweeping over the dry, cracked earth, she saw them. Tiny, insignificant, but undeniably there, a few, almost imperceptible, green shoots pushing through the soil. Fragile and tender, yet radiating a tenacious will to live. They were like pinpricks of emerald light on the vast, brown canvas of the field. Betsy sank to her knees, her fingers trembling as she touched one. It was real. The seeds had taken. Her gamble, her desperate act of faith, had yielded its first precious fruit. The field, once a symbol of their desolation, was slowly transforming. The ordered rows of tiny mounds, once just a pattern of dirt, now shimmered with the first faint promise of life, a delicate tapestry of hope woven into the very fabric of the earth. She looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, then back at the tiny sprouts. True faith, she realized, required more than just a single act of courage. It required daily sacrifices, constant labor, and an unyielding belief, even when the odds seemed impossible. And now, seeing these small green miracles, she knew they had only just begun. The Colorado summer descended upon Silver Creek with a new, relentless force. Days stretched on, one hotter than the last, turning the air into a thick, shimmering haze and the dust on the town streets into something as pervasive as despair itself. The sun hung in the sky like molten gold, scorching the last vestiges of moisture from every corner of the land. The streams, recently whispering of hope, now lay like dry, cracked snakes. Even the rare, precious spring on Betsy Harper's plot, their source of life, began to falter. Its once confident trickle reduced to a meager, intermittent drip. A pall of despondency hung over the town. Farmers, whose fields had once promised bounty, now walked with bowed heads, their faces gray with dust and hopelessness. The millers' crops, like most other neighbors, had withered, their stalks shriveled and yellowed, then, as the days wore on, turned into brittle, fragile remnants. The wind, whipping up dust clouds, carried not only sand but the scent of dying earth, the smell of blighted hopes, across the county. But on Betsy's plot, amidst the general desolation, something astonishing was happening. Her rows of corn, that Mexican, drought-resistant variety, continued to grow. Slowly, painfully, but they grew. Their leaves, though slightly drooping, remained green, and each stalk seemed to reach for the sky with an unyielding tenacity. These tiny green miracles, sustained by meager trickles from the weakened spring and conserved dew, stood out against the parched earth, like a silent but proud promise. Betsy walked among them, her heart clenching with fear, but also swelling with a strange, fierce pride. They were breathing, they were holding on. However, the physical hardships were only one part of their trials. An internal enemy, Fear lurked in the shadows, ready to strike. And it struck in the person of Mr. Craig, their landlord. He arrived in his battered buggy, his clean but worn coat and grim face signaling severe intentions. "Mrs. Harper," his voice was as cold as Morningstone. "The time has come. The rent is 2 weeks overdue. You will either pay or you will vacate. I have other tenants eager to take this place." Betsy felt her stomach clench into a cold knot. She tried to explain, pleaded for a small extension, mentioned that their crop would soon be ready, that it was their only chance. But Mr. Craig was unyielding. His gaze swept over her thin hands, her dusty dress, the parched field behind her. "Corn? In this drought? Mrs. Harper, don't make me laugh. You have 3 days, or I'll be back with the sheriff." His words were like a blow. 3 days. They would be homeless. The children. The image pierced her mind with terrifying clarity. Thomas and Anna, cast out onto the street like stray puppies, having lost everything. When Mr. Craig left, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and a feeling of utter despair, Betsy felt her strength drain away. She walked into the shack, her steps heavy, as if made of lead. The children, sensing something was wrong, grew quiet. Thomas, usually so resilient, looked at her with apprehension. Anna, her little angel, ran to her and hugged her leg. It was then that Betsy broke. She sank onto the old wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. Silent, burning tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving damp tracks in the dust. These were tears not only of despair but of guilt. She had gambled everything. And, perhaps, she had lost. She had exposed her children to such risk, such deprivation, for a mad, reckless hope. Faith. What was faith if it led only to ruin? Thomas and Anna had never seen her like this. She had always been a rock, their unshakable anchor in life's storms. Her tears were a shock to them, deeper than any threats. Anna cried with her, not understanding the reasons for her sorrow, but feeling its sharpness. Thomas, his young face contorted with pain, went to his mother. He didn't know what to say, but his hand, small and clumsy, rested on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. There was no reproach in his eyes, only a deep, new understanding that their mother was not all-powerful, but struggling for their sake. This sight, this unspoken gesture of support from her children, made Betsy pull herself together. She wiped her tears, her eyes still red, but now devoid of emptiness, only firm resolve. "It'll be all right, children," she whispered, her voice husky but steady. "We'll figure something out." Betsy's internal battle raged. She wanted to give up, to admit defeat, to concede that Mr. Miller was right, that the seed merchant was right, that she had been foolish to believe in a miracle. But she looked at her children, at their frightened but trusting eyes. They had no one but her, and she couldn't fail them, couldn't deprive them of their last hope. There was one last option. Her last. She rose and walked to the old dresser where their few valuables were kept. Among them, hidden beneath layers of worn clothes, lay Henry's thin, simple wedding band. It was made of old, dull gold, but to Betsy, it was worth the world. It was the only tangible link left to her husband, a symbol of their love, their shared life, their unfulfilled dreams. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The coldness of the metal against her skin was almost unbearable. To sell it, it would be like cutting off a part of herself, letting Henry go forever. But what was more important, the memory of the past or the future of her children? Without a word, Betsy put on her best, though dusty, dress and walked to town. The ring lay in her pocket, its weight immense. The jeweler, an old man with dull eyes, examined the ring. He offered her a small sum, far less than its true value. But Betsy didn't bargain. She needed the money, immediately. Clutching a few silver coins in her hand, she hurried back to the shack. But even with the money from the ring, it wasn't enough. Only half the amount needed for rent. Too little. The money dwindled like water in the desert. But on Betsy's field, the plants continued to grow, their stalks slowly thickening, their leaves turning a deeper green. Every day she came to the field, she saw them struggling. How they clung to life, like tiny green miracles amidst the scorched, suffering land. They were her reflection. Her faith, though eaten away by doubt, clung to these sprouts, like roots to the last source of moisture. The drought was not just a trial for her crop. It was a trial for her soul, Every day the sun rose in the sky and the earth remained dry. Betsy fought. Between despair and hope, between reason and intuition, between surrender and struggle. But when she looked at her corn, slowly, stubbornly reaching for the sky, she knew she couldn't give up. Not now, not when her children, despite everything, still looked at her with expectation. She might lose her home, she might lose everything, but she couldn't lose faith. And, perhaps, it was precisely then, when all seemed lost, that the deepest transformation occurred. One evening, as the sun, red and swollen, dipped below the horizon, and the air was so heavy it felt about to burst, something inexplicable happened. For the first time in weeks, the sky above Silver Creek began to darken not with dust, but with gathering clouds. The wind picked up, sweeping across the parched earth, and instead of the familiar scent of heat, it brought with it a fresh, invigorating aroma, the smell of rain. Betsy, exhausted by work and constant worry, stood on the porch of her shack, gazing at the sky. She was afraid to hope. How many times had they prayed for rain, and how many times had the sky remained indifferent? But this smell, it was different. It was a promise. And then, as the first heavy drops hit the dusty roof, and then the ground, Betsy felt relief wash over her body. It wasn't a downpour, not a storm, but it was a steady, saving rain, slowly and gently soaking the parched earth. It continued all night, quiet, persistent, as if nature had finally remembered its obligations. The next morning, the world looked different. The air was clean and fresh, the earth darkened with moisture, and every plant seemed to breathe new life. Betsy hurried to her plot. What she saw made her heart flutter. The corn, it had not merely survived the drought, it had flourished. Each stalk stood proudly, crowned with lush, green leaves, and, most importantly, each stalk bore ears of corn. They were unusually large, thick, with golden, silky tassels that hung down like precious threads. One by one, the ears filled out, promising an abundant harvest. The rustle of the leaves, as a light breeze swept across the field, was like a whisper, a song of life that the earth sang in gratitude. The field, yesterday still a humble patch of green amidst scorched earth, had now transformed into a golden sea of corn, gleaming in the morning sun. It wasn't just good, it was a miracle. News of Betsy Harper's extraordinary harvest spread through the county like wildfire. At first, it was whispers and disbelief, then curiosity, and finally, astonishment. People began to come. Farmers whose own crops had perished stood by the fence, shaking their heads. They touched the sturdy stalks, examined the unusually large ears, their faces a mix of envy and awe. Miracle corn, they whispered, and the name stuck. Mr. Miller, who had once advised Betsy to give up, now stood by her fence, his mustache drooping, his eyes wide. He said nothing, but his slumped figure spoke more eloquently than any words. Even the most skeptical person in the county could not deny the obvious. Where everything else had perished, Betsy Harper's corn thrived. Betsy met them with a cautious dignity. She did not boast, did not triumph. She simply stood by her field, her face weary, but with a proud gleam in her eyes. It was not just her achievement, but proof of her faith, her efforts, and the efforts of her children. Thomas and Anna, standing beside their mother, had also changed. Thomas, who had once doubted, now looked at the field with a sense of ownership and deep satisfaction. He explained to curious neighbors how they built the mounds, how they found water. His voice held genuine pride. Anna, recovered from her illness, ran between the rows, her laughter clear and free, her tiny fingers gently touching the golden ears. She understood that her mother had accomplished something truly special. For the first time in a long time, Betsy saw her children happy, truly free from oppressive fear. It was on one such day, as the field shimmered under the midday sun and a small crowd had gathered, that a lone rider appeared on the horizon. At first, he was just a dark speck, but as he drew closer, he became clearer. He was an elderly man, his figure straight and authoritative even in the saddle. He rode a magnificent black stallion, and his dark, expensive suit was impeccable despite the dusty road. His wide-brimmed hat only partially obscured his face, but even from a distance, His aura of power and position was palpable. He dismounted at the very edge of the field, his movements calm and confident. In his hand, he held a cane with a silver knob. His eyes, keen and sharp, hidden beneath thick gray eyebrows, intently surveyed the field, then glanced at the shack, and finally settled on Betsy. It was Silas Thornton, the wealthiest rancher in the county, whose land stretched to the horizon, and whose name was synonymous with power and success. He was a man who bought and sold entire towns, who held the fates of hundreds of people in his hands. And now he stood here, on Betsy Harper's plot, in her golden field. Betsy felt her body tense. She had heard of Thornton. He was known for his ruthless grasp and shrewdness. Suspicion, sharp and unpleasant, gripped her. After all they had endured, after all the hardship and labor, had this man come to take their achievement from them? To buy her land for a pittance, using his wealth and influence? Silas Thornton did not smile. His face wore an expression of deep interest, perhaps even admiration. He took a few steps into the field, his expensive boots sinking into the soft, damp soil. He picked one of the ears, peeled back its husks, and examined it carefully. The golden kernels gleamed in the sun. The contrast between Betsy's modesty and her family's poverty and the splendor of her harvest was striking. They were the embodiment of poverty, but their field screamed of unprecedented wealth. Betsy was proud of her accomplishment, but she was wary. The intention of this rich stranger was unknown, and she suspected the worst. Faith and hard work, it seemed, had wrought a miracle. But this new challenge required new wisdom. Silas Thornton looked up from the ear of corn, and his gaze met Betsy's once more. There was no greed on his face. There was something else, a question, and a deep, almost reverent acknowledgement. Betsy waited. A long, tense silence hung over the field. The rustle of the golden corn seemed to grow louder, filling the air with anticipation. She knew this moment would decide everything. The sun was setting, painting the sky over Colorado in fiery hues of orange, pink, and gold. The cornfield, once a barren, stony patch, now shimmered like a sea of gold, each ear bowing heavily in the wind. The golden colors of the sunset reflected in every kernel, and the rustle of the leaves seemed like the whisper of an ancient song, a song filled with hard-won hope and miracle. Silas Thornton, the wealthiest and most influential rancher in the county, stood amidst this splendor, holding an ear of corn. His face, usually stern and impassive, now expressed profound astonishment. He examined the ear, his fingers slowly gliding over the rows of perfectly formed kernels, then shifted his gaze to Betsy. Her face was shaded by her worn bonnet, but in her eyes, blue and deep, there was a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. "Mrs. Harper," Thornton finally spoke, his voice low but clear, like a distant rumble of thunder. "What you've done here, it's something extraordinary." He paused, as if weighing each word. "I've seen entire fields die in this drought. My own, your neighbors, everyone lost everything. And you have this." He gestured, encompassing the entire golden field. Betsy tensed, expecting an offer to buy, a demeaning price for her blood and tears. "Do you want the land?" she asked, her voice even devoid of emotion. Thornton chuckled, but his chuckle held no derision, only a hint of mild irony. "I have enough land, Mrs. Harper. Far more than I can cultivate. No, I didn't come for your land." He took a step closer, and Betsy instinctively noticed Thomas, standing beside her, shift subtly, ready to defend his mother. Anna, though small, gripped her hand tightly. "I came with an offer," Thornton continued. "This corn, it can change everything in this region. All farming life in these arid lands. It can be a salvation for hundreds of farmers who, like you, struggle every year. This is not just a crop. It's a revolution." Betsy raised an eyebrow in surprise. A revolution? She had merely been trying to save her family. "I am offering you a partnership," Thornton said. "Not a purchase, a partnership. I will provide you with a home." He nodded towards Betsy's humble shack, a larger, sturdy one, "on my land, but it will be yours. I will ensure education for your children, the best they can get. And..." He paused again, his gaze turning serious, "and a share of the profits from growing and distributing these seeds. A significant share. In exchange for the right to cultivate this corn on my lands." under your supervision. You will manage the process. You will be the one who teaches others." Thornton's words resonated in Betsy's mind like ringing bells. Her desperate faith, her reckless risk, her solitary struggle had led not only to the salvation of her family but to the opportunity to help an entire region. It was too grand, too incredible to grasp immediately. She, Betsy Harper, a widow with 2 children, who yesterday had been on the brink of starvation, could now become part of something far greater than she could have imagined. Betsy's internal conflict flared with new intensity. Could such luck be trusted after so much hardship? After all the pain life had brought her? Wasn't this just another trick of fate, only to take even more later? The fear of losing control over her destiny, over what she had built with such difficulty, was almost palpable. Her instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed, "Be careful. Nothing comes for free." But then she looked at her children. Thomas, standing beside her, his eyes wide, his face a mixture of awe and realization of the magnitude of what had happened. Anna, tugging at her dress hem, her small hand tightly gripping her fingers. They had seen her tears, her despair, but they had also seen her perseverance and her victory. Now they looked at her not just as a mother, but as an example of strength and wisdom. And that changed everything. You trust me?" Betsy asked, her voice slightly hoarse. Thornton smiled, and this time his smile was genuine. There was no arrogance or hidden motive in it. It was the smile of a man who saw something rare and precious. "I trust what I see, Mrs. Harper. I see a field where others saw a wasteland. I see tenacity where others saw despair. And I see corn that will change Colorado." He pointed to the golden field. "And that is your hand, your faith." Betsy's decision would determine not only her family's future but the legacy she would leave her children. To become a business partner to a respected man, to learn to value her own work properly. It wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving. Betsy looked at Thomas, then at Anna. In their eyes, she saw not only her struggle but the dawn of their own future. They would no longer starve. They would have an education. They would have a home, a real home. And perhaps, now that she could release some of her struggle, she could truly begin to live. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fresh air and golden corn. "I agree, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice firm and confident. "On your terms." Thornton nodded, his smile widening. He extended his hand to her. "Then it's a deal, Mrs. Harper. I hope this is the beginning of something great." The evening breeze swept through the field, and the golden corn rustled in response. Beyond Betsy's shack, far in the distance, lay Rancher Thornton's large house, its windows gleaming in the setting sun. The sky, painted in hues of hope, pink, gold, and soft violet, was serene and vast. Betsy turned to her children, her eyes shining. Thomas seemed to have grown several inches, his shoulders straightened, and an expression she had never seen before on his face: confidence. Anna, her little angel, jumped up and hugged her leg, her laughter the sweetest music Betsy had ever heard. In that moment, amidst the setting sun and the rustling corn, Betsy Harper, once a despairing widow, understood that sometimes the most reckless acts of faith led to the most unexpected blessings. Her belief in the impossible, the power of her maternal love to work miracles, had not only saved them, it had transformed their lives, giving them the opportunity to create a legacy that would grow and prosper, like the golden fields stretching before them.